Right, so this whole Russia situation, huh? It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's
We've
definitely
got this whole treasure trove of intel that you've sent over, and
right.
it seems like, I don't know about you, but everywhere I look, everyone's asking the same question.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Could this war, could this be the end for
Yes. No
Putin?
question.
Yeah,
I mean, the sources you sent, they paint a picture of this for sure.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely unsettling. Like we're looking at something really unsteady.
It's kind of like we're looking at this powder keg
Yeah.
and we're trying to figure out which spark is going to
Really.
set the whole thing off.
And the thing is, there are a few sparks out there, right? I mean, the report really digs into the power dynamics. And it's
Oh, for sure. And it seems like it's less about Putin himself and more about like who could actually challenge him.
right. Like, who are the players here?
Exactly. The players. So we're talking the oligarchs, obviously. We're talking
Yeah.
the military, always a factor.
Of course.
And this is the wild card, the Russian people themselves.
Oh, absolutely. And the report, it highlights some really alarming stuff coming out of Russia. Just like everyday people,
Wow. Tori.
searches for bankruptcy,
Yeah.
debt relief, even kidney donation. It's like through the roof since the war began.
Yeah. And I mean, can you blame them?
It's desperate.
Like basic economics, right? Sanctions have a cost. And that cost,
Yeah.
it always trickles down.
And it's not just money either, right? The report draws this really interesting parallel to the fall of the Soviet Union. Like back then, you had all this public discontent, people feeling the squeeze, but also this like loss of access, you know?
Right, like a loss of possibility. Like the world was opening up, but for them, it was slamming shut.
Exactly. And it's happening again. They had social media, international travel, even just like basic goods were becoming more available.
Totally. They had a taste of the good life, and
And then bam, it's like someone hit the rewind button on globalization.
that's got to be jarring to
Mhm.
have and then to have not.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, how much power do they really have?
Right, because the report also talks about Putin's grip on information
Mm.
and the crackdown on any kind of dissent.
Oh, yeah, he's got the clamps on for
Yeah,
sure.
it's textbook, unfortunately.
Classic playbook.
Mm,
Control the narrative, control the people.
mm.
It's as old as, well, as old as power itself.
Right, but even with all that, with the propaganda machine working overtime, this report is saying that the economic pain, just the sheer everyday reality of
A
it,
lived experience, yeah.
that might be the biggest threat to Putin's control
Because you can only tighten the screws so much before...
before something breaks.
Exactly.
And speaking of things that could break, let's talk about the oligarchs for a second.
Ah, yes, the oligarchs. Russia's, shall we say, ultra-wealthy,
I mean, these are the folks who've done pretty darn well under Putin.
to put it mildly.
But now the sanctions are really starting to bite, even for them.
Oh, yeah, they're feeling the pinch.
More like a punch in the gut from what I'm reading. This report, it brings up Roman Abramovich, remember him?
Oh, how could we forget Mr. Chelsea Football Club himself?
Well, the report says he's estimated to have lost, get this, over half his wealth in just a year.
Ouch, that's got to hurt, even if you've got billions. With a B.
So here's the million-dollar question. Could their money, could it actually become more important than their loyalty to Putin? Is a palace coup even, like, remotely possible?
Okay, so Palace, it's a juicy thought, right?
Right.
Like something out of HBO. But the report does hint that maybe, just maybe, the oligarchs aren't as united as they seem. Like there are whispers, cracks in the facade. It even mentions a few who've actually spoken out against the war publicly.
No way.
Yeah, and it hasn't gone well for them. Asset freezes, that kind of thing. We're talking a tiny minority here, but still.
Like a canary in the coal mine.
Exactly. If even a handful are willing to risk Putin's, well, let's say displeasure,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder what's being said when no one's listening.
Right, like what's the chatter behind those golden gates? But let's not forget, Putin, he's no fool. This report makes it very clear that he's always held the reins when it comes to the oligarchs. Builds them up, takes them down. It's all part of his game.
Exactly. The report actually uses Arkady Rotenberg as an example. This guy was basically gifted a state-run liquor monopoly, basically a license to print money.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Right. But it all comes back to Putin. Any oligarch who gets a little too big for their britches knows they could be next.
It's like a, I don't know, gilded cage, right? All the wealth in the world, but you're always looking over your shoulder.
Because the man with the key, he's watching.
Speaking of people watching, we can't forget the third player in this whole mess, the military. I mean, the Wagner Group thing, that whole uprising, that had to have rattled some cages in the Kremlin,
Oh,
right?
that was a wake-up call for sure.
Rattled. I'd say it practically blew the doors off the whole Putin's in control narrative.
Right. Talk about a crack in the facade. And speaking of cracks, what about the regular military? Not those Wagner guys.
Yeah, the report mentions this like growing discontent among some of the officers, especially about how the war is actually being run.
Yeah, the phrase motorcycle suicide squads comes to mind.
Oh, yeah. That's not exactly encouraging, is it?
Not exactly. It speaks to a certain, I don't know, desperation.
Hmm.
And honestly, a disregard for their own soldiers' lives.
It's like, hold on a second. Motorcycle suicide squads, are we talking about World War I tactics here?
I know, right? Yeah. It's almost comical, except it's not. Sending motorcycles against modern defenses? I mean, what are they thinking?
It's like something out of a dark comedy.
You're telling me. And the report quotes this military analyst who says there's this, like, growing indignation. Like, even within the ranks, they're like, what are we doing?
Okay, so indignation we got, but could they actually do anything? Like, could the military actually move against Putin?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question. And this is where it gets really interesting. The report talks about the FSB.
The FSB, for those of us who don't speak that acronym.
Right. So the FSB, Russia's main intelligence agency. And let me tell you, they have their fingers in everything. Communications, troop movements, you name it.
So like the KGB, but with a rebrand.
Basically.
Yeah.
But even more embedded.
Yeah.
Think of them as the eyes and ears of the Kremlin, but also the enforcers.
Big Brother's watching. Got it. But, I mean, haven't there always been purges and crackdowns in systems like this?
Oh, absolutely. That's how they keep everyone in line. And this report, it actually gets into some specifics. Apparently, over 30 generals have been, let's just say, removed from their posts since this whole thing started.
Removed being a euphemism for.
You get the idea. And look, it's impossible to say for sure, but you got to figure loyalty or the lack of it played a role.
Yeah, that's Putin sending a message for sure. Stay in line or else. So basically, he's got the oligarchs on a short leash and the military looking over their shoulders.
It's all about control, right?
Control and balance. But what happens if that balance tips? This report suggests that getting rid of Putin, it's not the silver bullet some people might think it is.
Yeah, about that. The report uses this phrase, power vacuum.
Okay. And a power vacuum in Russia. That sounds like a recipe for
chaos, instability.
all of the above.
The report specifically mentions this guy, Nikolai Patrushev. He's been a close advisor to Putin, head of the Security Council.
Patrushev, wait. Isn't that the guy who said that Western values were basically Satanism?
One and the same.
So not exactly a recipe for peace and harmony then?
Not exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the report, it kind of turns the whole thing on its head. It suggests that for a lot of Russians, this isn't even really Putin's war. It's Russia's war.
Wow. So like an existential threat?
Exactly, like a fight for survival. They see the West as this threat, and Putin, he's just, I don't know, the tip of the spear.
So even if hypothetically Putin were to disappear tomorrow,
Poof, gone.
all that stuff, the nationalism, the resentment towards the West, it wouldn't just magically go away?
Nope. And that's what makes this whole thing so, I don't know, uncomfortable. It's easy to point the finger at one guy, right?
Right, like he's the bad guy, end of story.
Exactly. But this report, it's like, it's forcing us to confront a much more complicated truth.
So less about good guys and bad guys and more about understanding the forces that got us to this point.
Exactly. And those forces, that's the key, because they might still be there even if Putin isn't.
We've been talking a lot about what the report says, but if we zoom out for a second, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do you want them to walk away with after this deep dive?
Honestly, I want them to walk away with a sense of, I don't know, realistic complexity. Like, this isn't a simple problem. It's messy. It's rooted in history and psychology and all these things that are
Bigger than just one man?
exactly.
Yeah.
And the more we try to simplify it, the less likely we are to actually deal with it.
So much to think about. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface here.
Oh, we've just started to peel back the layers.
This whole deep dive, it's a good reminder that sometimes the most important answers aren't the ones we find.
Ooh, I like
Wait.
that.
But the new questions we start asking.
Couldn't have said it better myself.